My grandfather used to say land was like a witness. It saw everything, remembered everything, and never forgot who truly belonged to it. When I was a kid, I thought that was just something old men said while leaning on fence posts and staring into the distance. Now I know better. The ranch remembered us, and when it was taken, it knew it didn't belong to the woman who tried to claim it. The ranch sat just outside Red Rock Valley, 300 acres of stubborn, sun-scorched earth that refused to be anything other than what it was. It had been in my family since 1939, passed down through calloused hands and hard years. My grandfather fought for it more than once against banks, developers, and distant relatives who smelled money and wanted their share. He won every time. Until the end, when he died, the inheritance felt quiet. There was no dramatic moment, no sudden sense of responsibility crashing down on me. Just a phone call from a lawyer, a few mailed documents, and a sentence that changed everything. You're the sole beneficiary. I was grateful, but distant. Life was messy, then career stress, a divorce still bleeding into my daily routine, and a constant feeling of being behind in everything that mattered. The ranch felt eternal, fixed, untouchable, so I postponed dealing with it. That delay was all someone like Linda Whitcomb needed. I didn't know her name at first. I only knew the letterhead, thick paper, overly formal language, and a logo depicting a mountain silhouette that didn't resemble anything within 50 miles of the actual land. The letter claimed my property was non-compliant with community standards and referenced noise complaints, livestock violations, and fencing issues. I laughed when I read it. There was no community anywhere near my ranch. The nearest neighbor was a windmill and a stand of juniper trees. I tossed the letter aside. Another arrived a month later. This one was sharper. It mentioned fines, jurisdiction, mandatory corrective action. It came from something called the Coyote Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. I had to look it up. That's when I learned a luxury development had sprung up along the northern edge of the variegated homes. Paved roads, manicured lawns planted where cattle once grazed. Still, I ignored it. What I didn't understand was that HOAs don't operate on common sense. They operate on paperwork, persistence, and intimidation. And Linda Whitcomb had built her entire personality around those three things. Linda was the HOA president, a retired real estate agent who treated the association like a personal empire. She believed rules mattered more than history, and appearances mattered more than legality. To her, the ranch wasn't heritage, it was an inconvenience, a wild, unmanaged blot next to her perfectly planned community. She sent more notices, final warnings, known compliance declarations. Each one escalated in tone, referencing meetings I'd never attended and decisions I'd never agreed to. Buried in the language was something far more dangerous than threats. Assumptions that I wouldn't respond, that I didn't care, that no one would stop her. At some point while my grandfather was already quietly pushed through something she called a boundary clarification. It redefined jurisdiction just enough to drag a portion of my ranch into her control. It wasn't legal. It wasn't valid, but it looked official, and that was enough for county clerks who didn't question it. From there, everything snowballed. She issued fines for violations that didn't exist, filed liens for unpaid fees I never owed, claimed the property was abandoned because I lived out of state. Each document fed the next, creating a paper trail that looked legitimate. If you didn't look too closely, and Linda never expected anyone to look closely, she told the HOA board she was handling the ranch issue. She told neighbors she was protecting property values. She told herself probably that she was doing the right thing. That belief gave her confidence. Confidence gave her audacity. Without my knowledge, without my consent, without any legal authority whatsoever, Linda Whitcomb sold my ranch. I didn't receive a notice. I didn't get a phone call. I found out the old-fashioned way by driving down the dirt road I'd known since childhood, and finding a chain stretched across the entrance. A padlock gleamed in the sun. A sign hung from it, bold and unforgiving. Private property. No, trespassing. My name wasn't on it. I stood there for a long time, dust blowing past my boots, trying to understand how land that had survived wars, droughts, and generations of stubborn men had been stolen with nothing more than forged signatures and unchecked authority. That was the moment I understood something else. My grandfather used to say, "Land doesn't forget, and neither do the people who fight to get it back." The sheriff who responded to my call arrived in a sun-faded cruiser, dust clinging to the tires like it belonged there. He listened patiently as I explained that the land behind the chain was mine, had always been mine. When I handed him my grandfather's will and the original deed, his expression shifted from neutral to uneasy. "County records show the property changed hands," he said carefully. Changed hands. The phrase didn't make sense. Not at first. Land like that didn't just change hands. It was inherited, defended, fought over, but never quietly sold off without someone noticing. I asked him who owned it now. He gave me a name I didn't recognize, a limited liability company tied to a development firm, and beneath that, a note that made my stomach drop. Foreclosure sale. I spent that night in a roadside motel, the kind with flickering lights and a chair that felt older than the bed. I spread every document I had across the blanket: deeds, tax receipts, probate records. That's when I saw it. A quitclaim deed bearing my name. only it wasn't my signature. It was close enough to pass at a glance, but wrong in all the ways that mattered. The slant was off, the pressure uneven. I'd signed my name the same way for decades, and whoever had written this didn't know that. Someone had forged it and notarized it. I felt the air leave my lungs. The notary stamp led back to a familiar surname, Whitcomb, a cousin, as it turned out. My hand shook as I made the connection. This wasn't an overreach or a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate, coordinated theft. The next morning, I called the number listed for Coyote Ridge Estates. Linda Whitcomb answered as if she'd been expecting me. "Oh yes," she said pleasantly. "The ranch matter has been resolved." Resolved? The word made my blood boil. She explained in a slow, patronizing tone that I'd failed to respond to HOA communications, that liens had accumulated, and that the association was legally obligated to act. She spoke like someone reciting policy, not confessing to a crime. When I told her she had no authority over my land, her voice sharpened. "You can't just ignore responsibilities because you live somewhere else," she said. "Absentee owners cause problems." I asked her if forging my signature was part of those responsibilities. She hung up by noon. I had a lawyer. By the end of the week, I had a team. They didn't mince words. What Linda had done wasn't a gray area. It was fraud, identity theft, abuse of authority, and she'd been careless in her confidence. Emails existed, filings existed, patterns existed. Every step she took had left a mark. As subpoenas went out, the story began to unravel. Linda had impersonated me in email exchanges with the county. She'd used HOA letterhead to pressure clerks into fast-tracking filings. She'd claimed emergency authority that didn't exist, and when someone hesitated, she reminded them loudly that she was a licensed real estate professional. She wasn't anymore. The deeper investigators dug, the more they found. Meeting minutes altered after the fact. Votes recorded that never happened. Board members who admitted they didn't fully understand what they'd approved. A development company that claimed ignorance but benefited handsomely from the sale. And through it all, Linda smiled. She told neighbors I was a scammer trying to reclaim land I'd lost fair and square. She posted cheerful HOA updates celebrating successful land recovery. She believed paperwork made her untouchable. Then the state got involved. When investigators seized her laptop and phone, the smile finally faltered. Digital trails don't care about confidence. IP addresses, timestamps, and saved drafts told the truth she never intended to share. One email, in particular, stood out. Sent to a fellow HOA officer, it read, "Once it's sold, he won't be able to afford the fight." That was when I knew she'd miscalculated, because I wasn't fighting for money. I was fighting for land that remembered who it belonged to. One day, woman who thought she could steal it without consequence was about to learn how wrong she was. The courtroom was colder than I expected, not just in temperature but in feeling. High ceilings, polished wood, and the quiet hum of fluorescent lights gave the place an air of permanence, like it had seen 1,000 lives unravel and wasn't impressed by any of them. Linda Whitcomb sat at the defense table in a tailored blazer, the color of pearl, posture rigid, chin lifted. She looked offended, deeply, personally offended that she had been dragged into a place like this. When the judge entered and the room rose, Linda didn't look at me. She stared straight ahead, as if refusing to acknowledge my existence might somehow erase the charges stacked neatly in front of her. They didn't. The prosecutor began with a timeline clear, relentless. Every action Linda had taken was placed in order, stripped of the polite language she'd hidden behind for so long. It started with the so-called boundary clarification, passed without proper notice or legal authority. Then the fines, dozens of them issued against land that wasn't subject to HOA rules. Then the liens, then the forged documents, then the sale. Each step built on the last. Like a staircase she'd confidently climbed without realizing it led straight into a prison cell. The defense tried to frame it as confusion, an administrative mistake, a misunderstanding of jurisdiction. But misunderstanding doesn't produce forged signatures, and mistakes don't require impersonation. When the prosecutor displayed the quitclaim deed on a large screen and asked me to identify the signature, the room went silent. "That isn't mine," I said. The handwriting expert agreed. So did the digital analyst who testified next, explaining how the document had been created on Linda's personal computer. Metadata doesn't lie. The timestamp matched an email Linda had sent minutes later, bragging that the ranch issue was finally handled. One witness after another took the stand. County clerks who admitted they'd felt pressured, HOA board members who confessed they hadn't fully understood what they were voting on, a notary, Linda's cousin, who invoked the Fifth Amendment and refused to answer questions altogether. The jury watched everything. They watched Linda's composure crack in small ways. A clenched jaw, a tapping foot, a hand tightening around a pen until it snapped. When it was my turn to testify, I didn't dramatize it. I didn't need to. I talked about my grandfather, about the land, about pulling up to the gate and seeing a chain where my childhood memories were supposed to be. I talked about the helplessness of realizing someone had erased decades of ownership with a few strokes of a pen. I didn't look at Linda while I spoke. I didn't have to. The prosecutor did, though. He turned toward her as he delivered the final argument. "This wasn't an accident," he said. This was entitlement, masquerading as authority. The defendant believed the rules applied to everyone but her. Deliberation took 3 hours. 3 hours of pacing hallways and staring at the floor while my lawyer told me not to read into anything. When the jury returned, I knew before the verdict was read. No hesitation, no uncertainty. Guilty. Guilty on multiple counts. Wire fraud, identity theft, falsification of public records, conspiracy to commit fraud. The words landed one after another, each heavier than the last. Linda didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply stared ahead, her face strained of color, her mouth set in a thin, rigid line. Sentencing came weeks later. The judge didn't soften his words. He spoke about abuse of power, about erosion of trust, about the danger of unchecked authority in private organizations like HOAs. Linda was sentenced to prison time, ordered to pay restitution, and permanently barred from serving in any HOA leadership role in the state. Coyote Ridge Estates didn't escape unscathed. The HOA was placed under external oversight, its powers were limited, its expansion plans frozen indefinitely. And just like that, the illusion of control Linda had built collapsed. The ranch was returned to me, free and clear, every fraudulent lien erased, every false record corrected. As I walked out of the courthouse that day, sunlight hit my face, warm and real. Justice, I realized, wasn't loud. It didn't gloat. It simply corrected the record, and for the first time since I'd seen that chain across the gate, I knew the land was coming home. The first night I spent back on the ranch, the sky felt impossibly wide. No city glow, no gated streetlights, no manicured hedges trying to control nature's edges. Just stars, sharp and endless, scattered across the darkness like they'd been waiting for me to return. I slept in the old house with the windows open, listening to the wind move through the grass the way it always had. It sounded like forgiveness. Restoring the ranch wasn't quick. Legal battles end on paper, but land takes time. Fences had been cut and replaced with cheaper ones that leaned like they'd given up. Survey stakes marked imaginary borders someone had tried to invent. A few access roads had been cleared where no road should ever exist. Each scar told the same story. Someone thought ownership was just a form you could file. I removed everything they added. Every post, every sign, every marker came out by hand. Not because it was efficient, but because it felt right. Like an apology. With each piece pulled free, the land seemed to relax, settling back into itself. Grass reclaimed tire tracks. The creek smoothed over the places where equipment had crossed it. Nature erased arrogance far more thoroughly than any court ruling ever could. People from the nearby development avoided me at first. I understood why. For months, Linda had filled their meetings with warnings about me, an irresponsible absentee owner, a threat to property values, a problem she'd heroically solved. Some of them believed her. Some had questioned it but stayed quiet. Silence, I'd learned, was one of her favorite tools. A few eventually came by. They didn't apologize directly. They asked about the cattle, about the history of the ranch, about my grandfather. I answered honestly, not bitterly. The truth didn't need embellishment. The more they learned, the more uncomfortable they became with what they'd allowed to happen. Discomfort, I realized, was a kind of accountability too. Life on the ranch settled into a rhythm. Repair at dawn, paperwork in the afternoons, long evenings watching the sun drop behind the hills, painting the land gold and red and purple. I found myself thinking about Linda less and the future more. Prison had taken her authority. Time would take the rest. Sometimes I wondered if she still believed she'd been right, if she told herself she'd only pushed too hard, trusted the wrong people, miscalculated the law. People like her rarely admit they were wrong. They just believe the world failed to understand them. Duranch understood. My grandfather's old journals surfaced while I was cleaning out a cabinet one afternoon. Inside were notes about drought years, fence repairs, cattle births, and one line that stuck with me. Land isn't owned, it's borrowed from those who come after. Lindo had treated it like a commodity, a problem to be solved, something to be controlled. That was her greatest mistake. The HOA still exists, but it's quieter now. Rules rewritten, powers restricted, meetings better attended. People ask questions instead of assuming someone else knows best. The illusion that authority equals morality is gone. That might be Linda's most lasting legacy, an example no one wants repeated. Every now and then, I stand at the old gate where the chain once hung. The post still bears a faint scratch where the lock rubbed against it. I left it there on purpose, not as a reminder of anger, but of vigilance, of what happens when people confuse paperwork with ownership and confidence with truth. The land stretches out in front of me, unchanged where it matters. It remembers my grandfather's boots. It remembers my childhood footsteps. It remembers who stayed and who fought. And now, it remembers this. It was taken once, it won't be taken again. Asterisk,